Once upon a time, there was a video game studio in Central Florida called InSpace. You likely haven't heard of them, and you wouldn't be alone. InSpace's portfolio is a bit checkered, ranging from the Duke Nukem spin-offs for the PS1 and Nintendo's Geist, all the way down to a whole slew of Mary-Kate and Ashley shovelware around the turn of the century. In 2005, they got a head start on the DS first-person shooter wave with GoldenEye Rogue Agent, a game that sold few and impressed even fewer. Still, it wasn't long before translating FPS and other high-budget action games to the DS sort of became their thing. They adapted games from respected franchises such as Star Wars and James Bond, and they even dipped their toes into Wii development for Tron Evolution. But if there's one thing InSpace was known for, it is without question their Call of Duty games for the Nintendo DS. Not exactly the first system that comes to mind when one thinks Call of Duty. But with an install base this large, it's no surprise that Activision wanted to cash in. Every Call of Duty game released between 2007 and 2011 received a port to the handheld, all developed by InSpace. These games have all been discussed on YouTube to some degree, but a common thread between these videos is that they seem to cover all of the games in one go. There's nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that these are more akin to first impressions than true reviews. And if I have a thing, it's devoting entirely too much time and energy to shit like this. So while I may be 14 years late and several console generations short, I think it's time to take a look at perhaps the least beloved Call of Duty games of all time. And I'd be remiss if I started anywhere but right here at the beginning. As per usual, let's talk shop first. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you probably know I go to some pretty absurd lengths to use real hardware whenever I can. This is partly a principal pursuit, but it's also a practical one. Nintendo DS games do not emulate all that well, especially those that rely on the touchscreen in unique ways. But I'm not about to point a camera at my DS, and DS capture cards are expensive. I'm not above emulation, provided it's at least somewhat official, and this is where the Wii U comes in. The Wii U gamepad is essentially the bottom half of a DS, complete with stylus and microphone, and the system makes a great DS emulation box. Nintendo released a small number of DS games on the eShop as part of the Virtual Console program. Nintendo hates the E word and the H word, so I can't go into too much detail, but you are able to play basically any DS game on the Wii U through Virtual Console. It's not perfect, and normally I just choose to wait until I could afford a better solution, but I really want to play this game. Seeing as it's the first of 5 COD games on the system, and the only one without online multiplayer for me to talk about, I can make an exception just this once. But I thought I'd put it out there in case there are any wild discrepancies from real hardware. I've played the game on real hardware, so I should be able to tell the difference between emulation issues and actual jank, but if not, well, here you go. As far off the rails as the Call of Duty franchise eventually ended up, the original Modern Warfare shows remarkable restraint that was absolutely intentional. Modern Warfare's first level is a somewhat restrained Black Op, with plenty of tension, suspense, and atmosphere. Call of Duty 4 may have been literally set in a new era, but it represents a new chapter for its creators too. One where war in their games didn't have to adhere to real-world history, but could instead look, sound, and unfold however they felt was best for the story they wanted to tell. InSpace did a very good job emulating the franchise's signature structure, but at the same time, they seemed to miss the memo when it came to the series' new direction. Modern Warfare for the DS very much reminds me of the World War II Call of Duty games that came before its release. And I mean that in every way it can be taken. Granted, most of my early Call of Duty experience is with the console games, but I do think the fact that I'm even comparing a DS game to something like Finest Hour or Big Red One speaks volumes. In terms of raw fidelity, this game and its sequels are among the most impressive on the DS. The visuals are clearer and the frame rate smoother than most PS1 games, which isn't half bad for a handheld release before the PlayStation was even discontinued. The PSP's graphics capabilities make the DS look like Pong, but there is something to be said for what InSpace were able to pull off here. The fact that the DS can handle this is somehow more impressive to me than the same series on a much more powerful handheld. But it's obvious that the technical hurdles InSpace had to clear for this project were not small ones, because as impressed as I may be, Modern Warfare DS is still a janky, limited experience. The levels are linear, railroady affairs with set pieces and typical COD objectives. You'll be planting C4 and calling in scripted airstrikes on scripted tanks. Ironically, not unlike Black Ops Declassified 5 years later. The concept is inoffensive, but the execution... Enemies pop into existence in spots that make their apparition blatantly apparent. Sometimes they even spawn directly in front of the player, something that can be replicated by running ahead sooner than the game expects. The touchscreen aiming may be mostly competent, but the use of a double tap gesture to aim down sights was a mistake. It either doesn't work, or it zooms in and out seemingly at random. Even when it does work as intended, the scoped aim feels extremely imprecise and sluggish. Shotgunners watch corners and one-shot you before you could hope to zero in on them. Hit detection means that some enemies go down in one bullet, while others dodge entire mags like they're in the Matrix. It's a shame, too, because when the stylus aiming is at its best, it feels really, really nice. But honestly, that's not even the issue. What confuses me about this game is that N-Space were obviously in very close communication with Infinity Ward during its development. Yet they seem to have completely missed the core ideas behind the lead studio's design decisions. Modern Warfare DS's levels are almost all adaptations of Infinity Ward's. Crew Expendable, Charlie Don't Surf, and No Fighting in the War Room all have rough DS version equivalents. The AC-130 level makes an appearance, and the final car chase even ends up on a crumbling bridge. But while these levels may look like the originals, they lack Infinity Ward's atmosphere, pacing, and subtlety. Now hold on. I know accusing a Call of Duty game of subtlety is a bold claim, but hear me out. Modern Warfare's levels are pretty damn tame by franchise standards. Call of Duty 4 may be full of explosions and shouty military men, but that's all punctuated by brilliant bouts of downtime. Slowly clearing rooms in Crew Expendable, taking in Al-Assad's palace in the opening credits sequence, cheering with the Marines as tanks roll into Iraq, laying in frozen fear as patrol passes and all gillied up, and experiencing Jackson's chilling end and aftermath. These moments involve little to no combat, but they're what make Modern Warfare's campaign memorable. Modern Warfare DS doesn't have this expert touch. Again, I didn't expect it to. It's a DS adaptation. There was no way it was going to reach the same narrative or cinematic heights as its namesake. But it doesn't take long to realize that N-Space threw out almost everything that made Modern Warfare's campaign what it was. There is a clear dichotomy between Marines and SAS missions in the full game. The Marines march into Iraq with all the subtlety of Kanye West, but playing as SOAP is usually a much quieter, more reserved experience. N-Space may initially seem to nail the adrenaline rush of Charlie Don't Surf, but the next level's take on the cargo ship raid is absolutely disgraceful. Crew Expendable is one of the greatest introductory levels in any first-person shooter ever. As cliched as it may be in retrospect, it's important to remember that this is the game that inspired all the copycats that made it cliche. With that in mind, imagine looking at this absolute masterpiece of a level and then saying, you know what this needs? A turret section. Come on. Crew Expendable is one of the simplest missions in the game, yet it's one of the most iconic. Implementing it better than N-Space did would have been as simple as deleting the turret section on helicopter, reducing the enemy count, and giving the player the element of surprise. The AC-130 level misses the mark in a similar way. Modern Warfare's IRTV footage could be mistaken for the real thing, but that has nothing to do with fidelity. Instead, it's the mission's slow-paced, minimal UI, and radio chatter that sell it. The navigator talks the TV operator through locating landmarks and targets in a way that doesn't feel contrived. The player is given just enough audio-visual guidance that they won't get lost or confused, but never so much that the villages and fields below feel like they exist solely for the player to blow up. The villages and fields in the DS version feel like they exist solely for the player to blow up. There's still radio chatter, but every building is outlined in either red or green to communicate whether or not you're allowed to shoot it. Rather than naturally guiding the player towards what they need to do, N-Space literally outlines it in bright neon colors. Meanwhile, the few things that aren't clearly conveyed are the few things that should have been. This reads as a ham-handed attempt at accommodating a younger audience, like the one the DS is likely to draw, but what it means in practice is just as much frustration, but without the payoff. Players are more likely to mute the audio in a handheld game, but better visual cues could have been implemented without taking a highlighter to the screen. And hell, if N-Space were so intent on imitating Infinity Ward's levels, I don't understand why they didn't copy Modern Warfare's story, structure, and pacing as well. This is the fourth time I've reviewed a Call of Duty spin-off like this, and doing so has led me to a conclusion. It isn't enough to simply adapt the game's mechanics. When it comes to the campaign, Call of Duty's raw gameplay is only one piece of the puzzle. The personality woven into the levels, characters, and stories is what elevates these games from decent shooting galleries to memorable experiences that people feel nostalgia for long after they've moved on. Anyone can make a set of decent scripted levels. The real challenge is to fill them with life and atmosphere. N-Space got so caught up in the former that they neglected to do the latter, instead choosing to fill all the memorable downtime with more mindless shooting that can't possibly reach the same heights as the game it tries to imitate. Activision claimed that N-Space was working on this game for at least a year, but having played their previous shooter and noticing how much of that game's DNA went completely unchanged, I find that extremely hard to believe. The lack of reload animations in Rogue Agent made sense. It was a callback to the original GoldenEye. But in Modern Warfare, it makes the game look unfinished, and seeing as they were added in the sequel, I think it's fair to say the developers agreed. Several weapons in this game are simple reskins of rogue agents. To a degree so absurd they turned the Dragunov into a bolt sniper, and for good measure, they used Modern Warfare's grenade launcher sound effect, just to drive home how little thought was put into this adaptation. So many decisions made here are completely nonsensical, and the most logical explanation is a lack of time to think said decisions through. A hypothesis supported by the state of this game's multiplayer. Online multiplayer shooters have been done on the DS before, but not without difficulty. Nintendo's own Metroid Prime Hunters was delayed so the mode could be included. Given the trouble I suspect N-Space wrestled with when working on this game, it isn't all that surprising that Modern Warfare DS doesn't support online play. But Call of Duty has always been known for its online multiplayer, and Modern Warfare was the entry that really sent it into the stratosphere. Given that even the game's PSP spin-off earlier in 2007 supported infrastructure networking, it is disappointing to see the franchise's DS debut fall short. Still, I was able to play a little of the game's multiplayer with a friend. Single cartridge play is an incredibly welcome feature that allows players to play free-for-all on 2 different maps with only 1 copy of the game between them. While multi-cartridge play opens up objective and team modes and many more levels, as well as the ability to choose a weapon besides the M16. And I have to say that my short time with this game's multiplayer was actually pretty fun, far more so than I expected out of a DS shooter. The best mode I played was an equivalent of Team Defender, and while the maps were a bit too large for 2 players, this would be a decent way to pass some time with a friend. It's a shame I couldn't play this game with more people. We'd unfortunately have to wait a little while longer for N-Space to figure out online multiplayer. Overall, I'm feeling a bit split on Modern Warfare DS. Not only does it manage to work in most of the Call of Duty staples that would later become part of the common first-person shooter lexicon, it also manages to take advantage of the platform's unique features, while looking decent and running well enough. But as others have included, this is definitely the worst Call of Duty game on the DS. However, this was still early days for the system, and more importantly, it was still just the beginning of N-Space's first-person shooter escapades. Having played a smattering of their later output, Modern Warfare DS puts into perspective how much N-Space grew as a developer in the years to come. And while they may not be around anymore, the studio left behind a supremely interesting catalog of games, many of which are genuinely worth playing if you're a fan of the DS. As nostalgia for this era of handheld gaming grows, I do hope that N-Space will eventually get the recognition they deserved.
Someone wants your attention.
Hello, Ellie. I stylus your head. Stylus.
Yummy.
Pen. Yummy.
No, wait, she'll eat it.
Dumb. Head empty.